My daughter kicked me out for being an extra mouth, and the move I made next changed everything. I'm 68 years old, and 3 months ago I learned that raising a successful daughter doesn't guarantee she'll care about you when you need her most. My daughter Amy is 34, and everything I thought I wanted her to become: independent, successful, and completely self-centered. What I didn't expect was for her to look at me like I was a burden that needed to be disposed of when my life fell apart. Let me back up and explain how I got here. 2 years ago, my wife Linda passed away after a brave fight with Alzheimer's. We'd been married for 42 years, and watching her fade away was the hardest thing I've ever experienced. By the end, she didn't recognize me anymore, didn't remember our life together, didn't even know her own name. But I stayed by her side every single day, because that's what you do when you love someone. Linda had been the heart of our family, the one who kept everyone connected. She organized birthday parties, holiday gatherings, and made sure Amy stayed in touch. Even when her career started consuming her life after Linda died, it was like the glue holding our family together just disappeared. Amy came to the funeral, of course, gave a nice speech about how much her mother meant to her, but 2 weeks later, it was like she'd moved on completely. I stayed in our family home for about a year after Linda passed, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. The house was too big for just me, 5 bedrooms and a yard I could barely keep up with anymore. My arthritis was getting worse, my blood pressure medication made me dizzy, and some days I could barely muster the energy to make myself dinner. Amy would call maybe once a week if I was lucky, usually just to check that I was still alive, not because she actually wanted to talk. The breaking point came when I had a minor heart episode last spring, nothing major, but scary enough that the neighbors called an ambulance. When Amy got the call from the hospital, she was annoyed that it interrupted her workday, not worried about my health. She showed up looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, asked the doctor a few perfunctory questions, and then told me she thought it was time I considered my options. My options, that's how she put it, like I was a problem that needed a solution. She started bringing up assisted living facilities, showing me brochures for places that looked more like prisons than homes. When I told her I wasn't ready for that yet, that I still felt capable of living independently, she got that frustrated look she'd worn since she was a teenager, whenever she didn't get her way immediately. Then came the financial pressure. Amy had always been good with money, maybe too good. She'd built a successful career in corporate finance and lived in one of those sterile modern condos downtown that cost more per month than I used to make in a year. She started lecturing me about how expensive it was to maintain the family home, about property taxes and utilities and repairs. The thing is, I wasn't asking her for money. I had my pension, Social Security, and some savings. Linda and I had been careful with our finances our whole lives. We weren't rich, but we weren't destitute either. But Amy kept talking like supporting me was this enormous burden she was carrying, when the truth was I'd been supporting myself just fine. What really bothered me wasn't the money talk, it was the way she looked at me like I was already dead, just too stubborn to lie down. You know that look when someone's calculating how much easier their life would be if you just weren't around anymore. Amy had perfected that expression. 6 months ago, she convinced me to sell the house, said it would be better for everyone if I moved in with her temporarily while we figured out a more permanent solution. I should have known it was a trap, but I was lonely and tired, and the idea of not being alone in that big empty house anymore seemed appealing. Moving in with Amy was a mistake from day one. Her condo was designed for one person, specifically one person who was never actually there. She worked 12-hour days most weekends, and when she was home, she acted like I was invading her space. My bedroom was actually her home office, so she'd set up a fold-out bed in the corner like I was a house guest who'd overstayed their welcome. I tried to be helpful. I'd clean up after myself, cook dinner for both of us, even though she rarely ate it, and stay out of her way when she was working, but nothing I did was right. The way I loaded the dishwasher was wrong. My cooking smelled up her kitchen, and apparently I watched TV too loudly, even though my hearing isn't what it used to be. The complaints started small, but they kept building. I was using too much hot water in the shower, leaving crumbs on the counter, making too much noise. When I got up early, I felt like I was walking on eggshells in what was supposed to be my temporary home, trying not to give her any more reasons to resent my presence. Then 3 months ago, everything came to a head. Amy had been unusually quiet for about a week, barely speaking to me, except to point out things I was supposedly doing wrong. I should have seen it coming, but I was too busy trying to be the perfect houseguest to recognize the signs. She came home from work on a Friday evening with that familiar frustrated expression and told me we needed to talk. Those 4 words that never lead anywhere good. She sat down across from me at her glass dining table, the one that always made me nervous because it looked too expensive to actually use, and delivered the speech she'd obviously been rehearsing. "Dad," she said, using that condescending tone she'd developed sometime in her 20s, "this arrangement isn't working out. I need my space back." And honestly, having an extra mouth to feed is putting a strain on my budget. An extra mouth to feed. I stared at her trying to process what she'd just said. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, and walked down the aisle at her wedding before her divorce 2 years later. This was the person I'd worked double shifts to put through college so she could have the opportunities Linda and I never had. Extra mouth to feed, like I was some stray dog she'd taken pity on instead of her father, who devoted his entire life to making sure she had everything she needed. But Amy wasn't done. She'd found what she called a perfect solution, a senior living community about an hour outside the city. It was affordable according to her research, and they had activities and meal plans and medical staff on site. Everything an aging parent could need, she said, like she was trying to sell me a vacation package. The way she presented it made it clear this wasn't a discussion, it was a notification. I had 2 weeks to pack my things and move to this place I'd never seen, to live among strangers in a facility that might as well have been on another planet for how often she'd realistically visit. I sat there listening to her outline her plan, feeling something I'd never felt toward my daughter before: disappointment. So deep it made my chest ache. This person I'd raised to be strong and independent had become someone who saw her own father as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. That night, I lay awake on that uncomfortable fold-out bed, staring at the ceiling and realizing that Amy had already written me off. She wasn't looking for a solution that would work for both of us. She was looking for a way to get me out of her life with minimal guilt. But what Amy didn't know was that her old man still had a few tricks up his sleeve. The next morning, Amy left for work without saying goodbye, which had become her standard routine over the past few weeks. I'd learned to recognize the sound of her heels clicking across the hardwood floor, followed by the slam of the front door. That meant I had the apartment to myself for the next 12 hours. I made myself coffee using the single-cup machine she'd reluctantly let me use and sat down to think about my situation, really think about it for the first time since this whole nightmare began. I'd been so focused on trying to be accommodating, so worried about being a burden, that I'd lost sight of what was actually happening here. My daughter wanted me gone, that much was clear, but the way she was going about it, the casual cruelty of calling me an extra mouth to feed, the complete dismissal of everything I'd done for her over the years, that revealed something about Amy's character that I'd been blind to for too long. See, I'd always made excuses for Amy's behavior, told myself she was just driven, focused, ambitious, all the things Linda and I had encouraged her to be. We'd celebrated her promotions, her salary increases, her ability to afford things we'd only dreamed of. We'd been proud that our little girl had made something of herself in the world. But somewhere along the way, Amy had learned to measure everything in terms of cost and benefit, including her relationships. She'd calculated that maintaining a relationship with her aging father was more expensive than it was worth, and she'd decided to cut her losses. The senior living facility brochure was still sitting on the coffee table where she'd left it the night before. I picked it up and really looked at it, this time Golden Sunset Manor, it was called, which sounded about as depressing as it looked in the pictures. The residents in the promotional photos all had that same vacant smile that said they'd given up on having any control over their own lives. I called the place pretending to be interested and spoke to a cheerful sales representative who was obviously used to dealing with adult children looking to warehouse their inconvenient parents. The monthly fee was substantial, not quite the bargain Amy had made it out to be, and the waiting list was 6 months long. 6 months, that meant Amy had been planning this for half a year, researching facilities, making inquiries, probably even putting down a deposit, all while pretending that my living with her was a temporary arrangement. While we figured things out together, she'd been lying to my face for months. When Amy came home that evening, I was waiting for her with the brochure in my hand. I asked her about the waiting list and watched her face change when she realized I'd called the facility. Her expression shifted from surprise to annoyance to something that looked almost like panic. Well, she said, setting down her briefcase with more force than necessary, I wanted to make sure we had options. I didn't want to wait until the last minute and find out there weren't any openings. Options, right? So she put me on a waiting list without telling me, essentially signing me up to be institutionalized without my knowledge or consent. I asked her when exactly she'd done this, and she got defensive, said she was just being proactive, just trying to plan ahead. But I could see the truth in her eyes. Amy had been counting down the days until she could ship me off to Golden Sunset Manor. She'd probably marked it on her calendar like any other business deadline. The fact that it was her father's life she was planning to dispose of didn't seem to weigh on her conscience at all. That's when she said something that made my blood run cold. Dad, you have to understand, this isn't personal, it's just practical. You need more care than I can provide, and keeping you here isn't sustainable for either of us. Not personal to move your father into a facility an hour away, where he doesn't know anyone, where he'll be lucky to see his daughter once a month, where he'll spend his remaining years among strangers waiting to die. I looked at this woman who shared my DNA, who'd sat on my shoulders at parades and cried in my arms when boys broke her heart, and I realized I didn't recognize her anymore. The Amy I'd raised would never have talked about her father like he was a business problem that needed solving. But there was more. Amy had apparently been researching my finances too. Without my permission, she knew about my pension, my social security, my savings account. She'd calculated exactly how much Golden Sunset Manor would cost and determined that I could afford it myself, which conveniently meant she wouldn't have to contribute anything. She'd done a complete cost-benefit analysis of my life and determined that the most efficient solution was to warehouse me somewhere I couldn't inconvenience her anymore. The fact that this place was an hour away from everything I'd ever known, everyone I'd ever cared about, was just a bonus as far as she was concerned. When I asked her how often she planned to visit, she got that same annoyed expression she'd worn when I'd asked about loading the dishwasher differently. As often as I can, Dad, but you know how busy work gets. Translation: never or close to it. I'd be lucky to see her on major holidays, and even then she'd probably find excuses to cut the visits short. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Amy dump me in some facility where I'd fade away forgotten and alone. If she wanted me out of her life, she was going to get exactly what she asked for, but not in the way she expected. I had resources Amy didn't know about, connections she'd never bothered to learn about, and a lifetime of experience dealing with people who underestimated me. She thought she was dealing with a helpless old man who'd gratefully accept whatever scraps of attention she was willing to throw my way. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The next morning, I started making phone calls. Amy had already left for work, so I had the whole day to set my plan in motion. The first call was to my old friend Frank, who'd been my construction supervisor back when I was working. Frank was about my age, but he'd invested in real estate over the years and now owned several rental properties around the city. Frank, I said when he picked up, I need a favor, and I think you're going to find this interesting. I explained my situation without going into too much detail about Amy's behavior. Frank had known Amy since she was little, had watched her grow up at company picnics and barbecues. When I told him I was looking for a place to rent, he immediately offered me one of his apartments. It's a nice one-bedroom place downtown, he said, much nicer than those senior facilities, and the rent's reasonable. I've got good tenants in the building, quiet, responsible people. You'd fit right in. But here's the thing, Frank said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I've been looking for someone to help me manage the properties, someone I trust who knows about maintenance and dealing with contractors. You interested in a little part-time work? Was I interested? Frank was offering me exactly what I needed, a place to live and a way to earn some extra income while staying active and useful. It was perfect, too perfect to be a coincidence. Frank had always been sharp, and I suspected he understood more about my situation than he was letting on. The second call was to my lawyer, Jim Patterson, who'd handled Linda's will and our estate planning. Jim was semi-retired, but he still took care of a few long-time clients. I told him I needed to review my will and make some changes. Some significant changes. I'd been planning to leave everything to Amy. It seemed like the natural thing to do as my only child, but Amy's behavior over the past few months had made me reconsider whether someone who saw her father as an extra mouth to feed deserved to inherit the fruits of a lifetime of hard work. Jim understood immediately. We should definitely review your options. He said there are several ways to structure your estate depending on your goals. My goals had become very clear. I wanted to make sure my money went to people who would appreciate it and use it well. Amy clearly didn't need my inheritance, and more importantly, she didn't deserve it. The third call was to my old buddy Carl, who worked at the bank where I'd had my accounts for over 30 years. Carl had helped me set up automatic bill payments and manage my finances after Linda died, and he'd always been straight with me about money matters. Carl, I said, I need to understand something about my accounts. Amy seems to think she knows details about my finances, and I'm wondering how that's possible. There was a pause before Carl answered. Thomas, the first probably shouldn't tell you this, but Amy came in about 6 months ago. She said she was helping you manage your affairs and asked for account balances and transaction histories. Had she now? I asked for copies of everything Amy had requested, and Carl promised to have it ready by the end of the day. When I picked up the paperwork, I wasn't surprised to see that Amy had been much more thorough than I'd realized. She'd requested information going back 2 years, essentially conducting a complete audit of my financial situation. This wasn't casual concern about her father's welfare. This was detailed research conducted by someone who wanted to know exactly what she stood to inherit. Amy had been planning my future based on calculations she'd made about my money, and she'd been doing it for months. That evening when Amy came home, I was sitting at her dining table with a stack of paperwork in front of me. She saw the bank documents and her face went pale. "Dad, what's all this about?" "Just reviewing my finances," I said, keeping my voice casual. I wanted to make sure I understood my options before making any big decisions. She sat down across from me, and I could see her trying to read the papers upside down. "Amy," I said, looking directly at her, "I've been thinking about what you said about this arrangement not working out, and I agree." Relief flooded her face. She probably thought I was going to make the Golden Sunset Manor transition easy for her. "I found a nice apartment downtown," I continued. "I'll be moving out this weekend." "An apartment," she said, and now she looked confused. "We're downtown, and how are you going to afford rent?" That's when I told her about Frank's offer, about the property management job, about how I'd be staying active and contributing instead of vegetating in some facility. Her expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like panic. "But Dad," she said, "you don't need to work. You should be retired enjoying your golden years." Enjoying my golden years, right? Like sitting in a sterile facility, playing bingo, and waiting for visits that would never come, was supposed to be enjoyable. I also told her I'd been reviewing my will. She tried to act like this was no big deal, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She'd clearly given a lot of thought to her inheritance. "I've decided to make some changes," I said. "I want to make sure my money goes to people and causes that really need it." "What kind of changes?" she asked, and her voice was carefully controlled. "Well, there's a scholarship fund at the community college that helps older adults go back to school, and the food bank where your mother used to volunteer. They could use ongoing support, and Frank's been talking about creating a fund to help seniors age in place in their own homes instead of being forced into institutions." Amy was quiet for a long time, processing what I just told her. She was smart enough to understand that I wasn't just talking about charitable giving. I was talking about fundamentally restructuring my estate in a way that would significantly reduce her inheritance. "But Dad," she said finally, "don't you think family should come first?" "Family," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Between us, you mean like how you put family first when you called me an extra mouth to feed?" Her face flushed red, but she didn't deny it. "Amy," I said, my voice staying calm, "you've made it very clear that you see me as a burden, an expense, an inconvenience to be managed. You've spent months researching ways to get me out of your life. With minimal effort on your part, you've been planning my future without consulting me, and you've been investigating my finances without my permission." I stood up and gathered my paperwork. "So I'm giving you exactly what you want. I'm getting out of your life, but I'm doing it on my terms, not yours." The move I was about to make would change everything, but not in the way Amy expected. Moving day arrived faster than Amy expected. I'd spent the week packing my belongings, which didn't amount to much after living in her spare room. For 6 months, most of my furniture was still in storage from when I'd sold the family home, so it was mainly clothes, books, and a few sentimental items. Frank showed up bright and early with his pickup truck ready to help me move. Amy had already left for work, which was probably for the best. She'd been unusually quiet all week. Ever since our conversation about my will, I could tell she was trying to figure out how to approach the subject without seeming greedy, but she hadn't found the right angle yet. The apartment Frank had found for me was everything he'd promised: a clean one-bedroom unit in a well-maintained building with tenants who actually seemed happy to be there. The previous tenant had been an elderly woman who'd moved to be closer to her grandchildren, and she'd taken excellent care of the place. More importantly, the building was in the heart of downtown, walking distance to restaurants, shops, the library, and the community center where Linda used to volunteer. I'd have more social opportunities in 1 week than I'd had in 6 months of living with Amy. Frank introduced me to Mrs. Chun, who lived next door. She was a retired teacher about my age who immediately invited me over for coffee and told me about the building's weekly poker game. Apparently, I'd landed in the middle of a thriving community of active seniors who looked out for each other. This is what retirement should look like, I thought, as Mrs. Chun showed me around the building's common areas, not warehoused in some facility, but living independently among friends and peers. By the time Amy came home from work that evening, I was completely moved out. I'd left my keys on her kitchen counter along with a note thanking her for her hospitality and giving her my new address and phone number. She called me within an hour. "Dad," she said, and I could hear the strain in her voice, "I didn't expect you to move out so quickly. I told you I was moving this weekend. Amy, you've been complaining about me being here for months. I thought you'd be relieved." "Well, yes, but we should have talked about this more, planned it better." "Planned it better like the way you planned to put me in Golden Sunset Manor without discussing it with me first." There was a long pause before she said, "Dad, about your will, we should really sit down and talk about your plans." And there was the real reason for her call. Amy had spent the week calculating how much money she stood to lose if I followed through on my threats to restructure my estate. She suggested we meet for dinner that weekend to discuss my future plans. The irony wasn't lost on me. A week ago, she couldn't wait to get me out of her life. Now suddenly, she wanted to have long conversations about my well-being. I agreed to meet her, but I had my own agenda. The restaurant she chose was expensive, which told me she was planning to put some effort into this conversation. She was dressed nicely, had obviously prepared talking points, and was using her most caring daughter voice. Dad, she began, I've been thinking about what you said about changing your will, and I'm worried you're making emotional decisions that you might regret later. Emotional decisions, interesting way to frame it, Amy. She launched into a speech about the importance of family, about how she'd always be there for me, about how she just wanted what was best for me. The same woman who'd called me an extra mouth to feed was now talking about family loyalty and unconditional love. But I let her talk because I was curious to see how far she'd go. She even apologized, she said she realized she'd been stressed and hadn't handled the living situation as well as she could have. She talked about finding better ways to support me going forward, about being more involved in my life. It was a performance worthy of an award, and it might have worked if I hadn't spent the past week talking to Frank, Mrs. Chuen, and the other residents of my new building, people who actually enjoyed spending time with older adults who saw experience and wisdom as assets rather than liabilities. Amy, I said when she finally finished, I appreciate the apology, I really do, but I've made my decision about the will, and I'm comfortable with it. But don't you want your money to stay in the family? She asked. It is staying in the family. I said the community college scholarship is going to help people like your grandfather who never got the chance to finish his education. The food bank serves families in the neighborhood where you grew up, and the fund to help seniors age in place that's going to help people maintain their dignity and independence instead of being shuffled off to institutions. Amy's carefully composed expression started to crack. But what about me? She said. What about your actual daughter? What about you, Amy? You make more money in a year than I made in 5. You own a condo that's worth more than the house I raised you, and you've got a successful career and a bright future. You don't need my money. But it's not about needing it, she said. It's about what it represents. It's about family legacy. Family legacy. I thought about that for a moment. Amy, you want to know what my legacy is? It's not money. It's the way I raised you to be independent and self-sufficient, the way I taught you to work hard and take care of yourself. You've achieved all of that. But somewhere along the way you forgot that success isn't just about accumulating wealth. It's about how you treat the people who love you. It's about remembering where you came from and taking care of the community that helped shape you. I pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. Amy opened it and found a copy of my revised will. The bulk of my estate was indeed going to charitable causes, but I hadn't completely cut her out. She was still inheriting enough to make a difference, just not enough to retire on. She stared at the papers for a long time. Dad, she said quietly, I know I haven't been the daughter you deserved lately. I got so focused on my career, on being successful, that I forgot what really matters. That was closer to a real apology than anything she'd said before. Amy, I said, I hope someday you'll understand that the way you treated me these past few months wasn't just hurtful. It was a window into who you've become, and that person isn't someone I'm proud of. But people can change, I continued. Your mother always said you had a good heart buried under all that ambition. Maybe losing most of your inheritance will help you find it again. 6 months later, Amy and I have a better relationship than we've had in years. She visits me regularly, not because she feels obligated, but because she seems to genuinely enjoy our conversations. She started volunteering at the food bank, where Linda used to work, and she's mentioned wanting to contribute to the scholarship fund herself. Frank's property management job turned out to be exactly what I needed. I stay busy, help other tenants with maintenance issues, and earn enough to supplement my pension. I've got a social life again, thanks to Mrs. Chuen and the poker group, and I feel useful in a way I hadn't for years. The apartment is perfect, the building is full of interesting people, and I wake up every morning looking forward to the day ahead. Amy learned that treating family like a burden has consequences, and I learned that sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the opportunity to become a better person, even if it costs them most of their inheritance. To learn the lesson,